The OnePlus Nord, flagship features for less money. That's the sales pitch, and it's one that suggests that the company's going back to its roots. OnePlus first made a name for itself offering major flagship features for hundreds of dollars less than the current flagships from, say, Samsung and Apple. And the company is making quite the big deal about its return to the mid-range smartphone space. And you know what? Some of the specs suggest this phone might be worth the hype. It has a 6.4-inch screen capable of 90Hz refresh rates, as well as 4 rear-facing cameras, and importantly in 2020, 5G. Those are a hell of a lot of flagship bullet points, but for under $500 or $379 in the UK or €399 in the rest of Europe, there are some compromises. If you're thinking of shifting or downsizing from older flagship phones or want to save, a couple of $100s on the very latest smartphone, concessions will have to be made. But you know what? After a week with the OnePlus Nord, I kind of forgot about those. Let's set aside the fact that this phone isn't even going to launch in the US because, regardless, mid-range phones are kind of having a moment. If it's not Apple's iPhone SE back from the dead, it's Samsung's Galaxy A series or the Pixel 3a, soon to be the Pixel 4a. And arguably, the OnePlus Nord does the best job of pretending it is a flagship, even when it isn't. Maybe it's because the Nord is about as big as the iPhone 11 Pro Max, maybe because it comes in this glossy, colourful finish. Maybe it's simply because it just has so many camera sensors attached to it. It's a flagship at first sight. Now, it's not quite the same as, say, OnePlus's last phone, the flagship 8 Pro. To start with, the screen doesn't have those subtle curves to the sides, which definitely makes this phone cheaper to make. It also has a really cheap feeling screen protector already pre-installed on top of that 6.4-inch screen, and that's probably the major thing that makes this phone feel like it's not a flagship phone. Any other manufacturing cost savings? Well, the frame itself is plastic, albeit with a metallic finish. Probably enough to trick me, maybe even you. And rest assured, the alert slider button is still there, and that's made out of metal at least. Another OnePlus mainstay feature that's here on the Nord is Warp Charge, which will take the phone from 0 to 70% charged in just 30 minutes. And then we come to the next compromise at this price point. There's no wireless charging. Now, either you love it or you just don't care either way. I mean, I work at Engadget, so even from my peripheral vision, I can already see 2 wireless chargers. I have them, and I'll admit I absentmindedly tried to charge the Nord on a wireless charger. Obviously, it didn't work. You might miss the feature. I certainly did. The Nord has a 4150 mAh battery built in, and that's good for about 2 days of use. After a particularly intensive day of use, I still had around 40 to 50% battery left. Which is a good sign given that the screen is working at 90Hz most of the time I used it. Let's come back to that 90Hz feature because that's kind of a big deal at this price. Most phones usually refresh at 60Hz, so that's a huge jump up. And that translates to a slicker, smoother interface with apps and the software in general. I've spent time with phones with 90 and even 120Hz displays before, and it's always perceptibly jarring to downgrade yourself back to 60Hz, say on an iPhone or plenty of other devices. This is what sets the OnePlus Nord apart from the competition. There are no pop-out cameras this time around, but OnePlus has gone for 2 selfie cameras built into the screen. You'll get a 32 megapixel sensor and an 8 megapixel sensor. You may have seen a similar setup on recent Samsung phones, and it's another way of the phone intimating that it's a flagship, even when it's not. Now, this is one of the first devices we've got to test featuring Snapdragon's 765G processor, which importantly also features a 5G modem built in. Maybe I was tricked by the 90Hz display, but the phone seemed to run pretty smoothly. For the most part. Games like Fortnite did make the frame rate a little bit choppy, and that was regardless of how strong my Wi-Fi connection was. I also found the Nord struggled with dense web pages that featured perhaps embedded video or other media. But 90% of the time, I didn't feel that the Nord was lacking in any power. And in fact, it had more than enough power for me to play Stadia games without an issue whatsoever. Now, OnePlus has a bit of a reputation for middling smartphone camera performance. Fortunately, that's not really an issue for the OnePlus Nord. More cameras normally mean better results, and that's very much true here. First up, the primary camera, which has a 48 megapixel sensor, an f1.75 lens, and optical image stabilization. That last one's pretty impressive for a mid-range phone. The camera app typically defaults to 12 megapixel stills, which means it drops some of the pixels for clearer, better photography. But you can still use the full 48 megapixel mode if you want to, and if you want all that detail. And because it's such a huge sensor, that offers up a 2x zoom mode, although that's not necessarily class leading. We're playing with 5x zoom in other phones at the moment. Alongside that, there's an 8 megapixel ultra wide angle lens, a 2 megapixel macro camera for God knows what, I still don't get the relevance, and another sensor for depth perception. That'll help with your portrait mode photography. And let's not forget on those front-facing cameras, because there's 2 of them that can also handle portrait mode. And the images themselves come out well. It's not going to best the iPhone 11 Pro or Huawei P40 Pro, but you'll be pleasantly surprised at the images you can get at a phone at this price. Even when I shot in darker settings, noise never seemed to get too much out of control, probably thanks to the aforementioned optical image stabilization. That said, I've noticed across the modes, including Nightscape, that the phone does act a little bit too aggressive with yellow tones, trying to intentionally auto white balance things to a lighter, whiter shade than what's naturally occurring. The phone is more versatile than the Pixel 3a thanks to the ultra-wide angle camera and that ability to 2x zoom, but the Nord's competition will probably be the Pixel 4a that is also expected to land this summer. So is the OnePlus Nord worthy of all this hype? For you, for me? Well, even if it's not coming out in the US, I believe it is. I like the Nord. It's very much punching above its weight to the extent that it's pretty much beaten out the OnePlus 8. The Nord is a better camera that costs even less. But timing is everything. Besides all these other fantastic mid-range phones we're starting to see, we're in the middle of pretty much a global recession. Is now the right time to be buying a new phone, downgrading or upgrading or swapping devices? And if you've been using flagship phones for the last few years, but are looking to maybe make a switch to a mid-range device, are you willing to live with the compromises you'll be making? It might not have IP water resistance, the Nord doesn't. And it might not have wireless charging, which you might not care about. It's all incredibly subjective, but there's never been a wider choice of phones around this price point. It's all starting to get incredibly subjective, but fortunately there's never been so much choice, especially around this $500 mark. There are now a handful of phones offering incredible cost to performance ratios, and I'd put the OnePlus Nord at the top of that list. Thanks for watching, and check out my full detailed review with more camera samples at Engadget.com. Like and subscribe, and we'll see you soon.